hate to hold these people up. I know we'll have some more that will join us. So guys, thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're, of course, all very excited about hearing from Rob again. I know that you have all heard Rob over time, and those of you who are in PI 11 just recently heard him. And his message each time he has talked with us is about the human side of change. And today's message continues in that same overall idea, but today Rob's going to take a little different approach and talk about that leadership group on your campus that supports your work in implementing change on the campus. And so as we shared with PI 11, the learning plan that is posted for you to use both before and after you use Rob's video that will be recorded today really sort of centers on working with the APs, the instructional specialists, maybe your teacher leaders on your campus along this idea of leading change on the campus. So as you know, Stephanie will be recording today, and so we'll have that posted as well for you to use whenever you're ready to use it. So I don't think Rob needs any introduction whatsoever to this group. You all know that he was a clinical psychologist and he focused on the psychology of change, but more importantly, he has been a great friend to Into Learning and to the Principals Institute, and any chance we get to have a conversation with him is always a treat for all of us. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Rob, it's all yours.
Thank you, Roz. Nice to see you all. And Samara, those are some earrings. I got to say, they really stand out. What's the t-shirt say?
So the t-shirt is our school theme this year, which is can't stop, won't stop, learning, growing, inspiring.
Oh, nice. Okay, good. So let's, I want to, since we're a small group, we can try to make this as concretely useful as possible to you all. And I don't know what the specific, but it would help me a little just to get a quick take. So let me give a little context and then see if I can get you to help me a little and then go on and talk some more. My experience about almost anything that's happening in schools last year and this year has been that lots of creative school people have been caught in a sort of a dilemma between, on the one hand, a wish and often a very clear need to move the school forward, to move the instructional program forward, to continue to upgrade teachers' skills, their capacity to reach a broad range of students, et cetera. And lots of the times the changes that have needed to come along with that have involved other sorts of things on the campus, sometimes the schedule, for example, or the evaluation system or what have you. And on the other hand, we are, at this point, we're about almost 18 months into COVID. And, this year is in some ways not as hard as last year because all the stuff, for example, about any sort of online instruction was all new last year and so on. And there were lots of other challenges. And at this time last year, we didn't have any vaccine, for example, and so on. People found the year scary and exhausting and whatnot. This year, we thought back in June, I don't know if you remember this, that it was going to be different. It looked then like vaccination was going to, even in places where people don't all want the vaccine, there were going to be a chance for lots of folks to be vaccinated, eventually lots of students. Then we got the Delta variant, and it turned out we were back to masks in lots of places, and also the controversies about masks and et cetera, and back to some kind of social distancing in lots of schools. I don't know what you've all been doing about that. But this fall, I've heard a number of things that came sort of out of the blue and that have made it hard for lots of leaders to think or to find the bandwidth among faculty to keep forging ahead about certain initiatives because of this sort of collective exhaustion, fatigue, and distress from COVID. So, for example, one thing, and Aroused and Stephanie and I were talking about this at the beginning, you know, everybody was focused last spring on what are the schools going to do about learning loss. And then we started this year, and what we inherited, it turns out, was an awful lot of behavior loss. And across the country, people have been saying the same things. It's amazing. There's no school. I've been in touch with some of the wealthiest private schools in the country and some of the most poorly funded public schools in the country, and all sorts of things in between this fall. And they're saying the same thing. The kindergartners are behaving like 3-year-olds. The 8th graders are behaving like 6th graders. In the high schools, it's like having 2 freshman classes, because last year's freshmen, who are now sophomores, didn't really have a full real freshman year. And we've got 2 sort of beginner groups here. There are lots of schools where they've had more fights than they usually have. There's lots of schools where there's been more friction and so on. And it has taken teachers especially by surprise. You know, one teacher, a middle school teacher, said to me just the other day, I have these 8th graders in my class. That's what I teach, 8th grade. And they have 8th grade bodies, and they're behaving like 6th graders. And I'm trying to teach the 8th grade stuff and get them caught up on it. But I've got a bunch of kids. I never chose to teach 6th grade. I didn't want to teach 6th grade. And that's what I'm supposed to be doing this year. Now, I'm going to have to find some way to do that. In addition, there are other sorts of things, and I don't know how things are in Texas. I can tell you in Massachusetts, there is not a single substitute teacher available. Do you actually have subs in Texas? You do, your schools? Oh, good. Oh, no, just a little, okay. In Massachusetts, we actually have some districts where some of the bus drivers are National Guardsmen mobilized by the governor because there aren't enough people willing to drive the buses. Lots of places are having trouble feeding the kids adequately because cafeteria staff are scarce. You know, it's hard to think about big picture changes going forward when you can't manage lunch. I know a lot of principals and assistant principals who are actually doing lunch duty, but lunch duty often from behind the counter serving, you know, at times when they need to, stuff like that. And then the other thing is that I've heard a lot this fall about schools having more challenges dealing with parents who seem to have recovered from any gratitude they had about whatever you did last year, and who are more likely than they ever were to take literally as true what the student says when he goes home about what happened, and then call up and say, I know he couldn't have done that because he told me so. Or I can't believe you're doing this to my son, or whatever. So for lots of schools, there's a dilemma because leaders don't want to stand pat and just get through. And yet there's a lot of stuff we didn't plan for that has actually intruded on some of the hopes and wishes about where we could go. So that's a short form of some of what I've been hearing. So I want to check this out. Yes, no, this matching up with your experience? Yes, Samora, you're nodding. Would you say something about it?
Yes, definitely. I think all of it. We do have substitutes. We don't always have enough for each day, but you know, usually we're a class or 2 short maybe. still dealing with, staff members that are still, testing positive for COVID here and there, and they have to be out for 2 weeks, and it's hard to find a substitute for that long of a period of time.
Yes, yes.
Our district decided to have long-term substitutes us to be able to hire an associate teacher position.
Yep.
So that has helped us cover some things, but it's like, they're kind of covering positions that are still open that we can't find
Yes.
anybody for, like paras.
Yep.
So they're still
Paras,
not.
nobody can get paras as far as I can.
Yeah, it's been pretty challenging all the way around.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we got it all at the beginning.
We're having issues here with transportation specifically. And we have, regarding really our special education transportation buses, and we have students and teachers here that are here an hour plus after the dismissal bell because waiting on buses. And I mentioned to my husband, Rob, after our Into meeting last week that, the National Guard was helping out. And my husband is a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard. And I told him that we needed his services and he needed to get his soldiers out on my campus driving buses. And he asked for your phone number.
Yeah, I think the governor has to do that, Charlie, if I'm not mistaken.
No, he does. I know. But I thought it was a great idea because we need bus drivers and we need cafeteria workers and custodians.
Yes. So the other thing about these two, that the two of you have said is true. I've been in touch with a couple of schools recently where they had a sudden rash in late September of like 3-4 teachers going out on FMLA and suddenly having to be covered for, and without knowing it at the start of the year. So it caught them, by surprise. And it's understandable for the individual situations, but very hard on the school. And then a couple of these teachers are now back. This is an elementary school, and they were surprised and upset that their colleagues were mad that they had to cover for these people while they were gone. There's that. So Siobhan, if I got your name right, you were on screen a minute ago and you were going to say something. Are you still with us? No, she may have been called away. Yes.
Hey, Rob.
Hi, what were you going to say?
Well, I have my leadership team here and we were talking about it, and thankfully we're not having, knock on wood, the sub issue that we were having at the very beginning. I mean, I was subbing, my counselor was subbing, the AC, we're all teaching PE and, character ed in first grade. But what we're dealing with a lot right now is the gratitude, lack of it from parents is what we see 90%. It's like Rob said, we're not the heroes anymore. Now it's like, here's my kid. They may have not been in school for a year, but you figure it out. And I'm sure they're the sweetest kid ever. So we're seeing that a lot. And thankfully, we're not having the COVID, positive test at all.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Knock on wood.
Yeah. But, one of the hardest things about all this, it'd be one thing, imagine that we all knew that COVID was going to get worse for the next 6 weeks, and then it was going to drop off and almost disappear. The next 6 weeks would be awful, but we'd have something in sight, that we could count on. And we don't have that. That's part of the trouble. We actually don't know what's going to be next, when another shoe is going to drop. Last year, I was in touch with tons and tons of schools and stuff, and it was clear that classroom teachers had a very hard year. There's no two ways about it. It was really hard. They had all the stuff we all did about COVID and what could happen to us and so on, plus all the things about having to try to teach online or whatever it was going to be that people did, or hybrid models and this and that and the other. But the people who had it worse for me consistently were the people on the leadership team. So, Charlie, you have an AP with you. Siobhan, you said you have your team with you. So are these people still standing?
Barely.
Barely, yeah. Because if we backed all the way up, we shut schools in March, right? And then we sort of finished up the year. And then that summer, teachers had time off. It wasn't a comfortable time because COVID was going nuts and people were scared of dying and the death tolls were, skyrocketing and stuff. But administrators got to stay all summer and plan, and we had to plan multiple scenarios, if you remember that. Is it going to be this? If it's going to be that, whatever. I had a middle school principal say to me in August of that year, I said it to the PI group at one point. She said, we started a meeting in August. She said, but before we do anything else, I just want to say, if I hear the word pivot or iterate or iteration one more time, I'm going to throw my laptop through the window. She said, I have spent the whole damn day here measuring 6-foot distances between desks in classrooms. That was back then. Then we had all last year. And this summer we had it again, not maybe quite as much, but the planning was still uncertain. And here we are. And leadership teams who would like to be thinking about constructive ways to promote growth and change and improvement in school have been enmeshed in all the things about coverage and trying to get by and having to deal with high stress levels among faculty and among parents, and then behavior issues in kids, right? So, you could have gone into the aluminum siding business. That's what I always think of, It's stressful too, but not quite the same, not quite in the same way. So I'm always interested to know, in the face of this, is there something right now that you who are on this call would like to be able to do yourself or have your team do that would be directly helpful to the school, whether it's in the sort of big picture way of moving it forward, into the future, or it's more immediate in terms of coping with all the stuff that I've just been listing? So if somebody said to you, is there, you've got something on your list that you'd really, really wish you could do, or would like some help thinking about how to do in ways that you could mobilize your team, or that would be good for the team to be able to do, or that kind of stuff? I mean, you came on the call for some reason. Either you're bored to death, or you have nothing better to do, or so.
I'll give it a shot, Rob.
Okay, please.
Sorry, I just to apologize for the first 10 minutes. I was stuck in traffic on the way home. So now I'm on and I was listening. You just couldn't see me. But
we're glad to have you with us.
Thank you. So I just moved from a campus principal position this year into a district office position. And along with all your comments, we're just seeing everything you're saying. And it's amazing. I almost feel guilty for not being a campus principal anymore, because I just know how hard they're working and how hard it is, and not having to deal with it every day. I don't know. I feel this weird sense of guilt. But I think to your question is how to break the cycle, of that we're overwhelmed because we're overwhelmed, and then we're overwhelmed because we're overwhelmed because we're overwhelmed. I don't know if that makes sense, but we want our organization to move forward. So I'm in the curriculum or teaching and learning department. We want to continue to support teacher growth, which was valued deeply, and it still is in our district. But teachers and principals, people working on campuses, are just so overwhelmed. We don't want to put anything more on their plate, but they also have a skill set that they need to have developed to deal with some of the things that they're facing day in and day out in their work with students. So I'm not talking about training them to be better at driving buses and serving burritos, but how do we help build that skill set without overwhelming them, so then long-term they'll feel better equipped to respond to some of the challenges with students, whether it be academic or behavior. Hope that makes sense.
It sure does. The rest of you listening to that, didn't that make sense to you? I'll bet it does. When you were listening, Chris saying that, did you have a take, some of you were thinking about? For you?
I'm in the same situation as Chris. And so I'm new to the district office. And I also, Chris, I'm right there with you on the guilt. I feel guilty for not being on a campus.
Yeah, you both escaped. You both escaped and gave the job to somebody else who's now just in, okay, go ahead, stay with it. Stay with it.
It's the same. We were just meeting with our curriculum coordinators individually, just to kind of talk about how they're progressing with their goals and their, what they're working on this year. And every single one of them separately mentioned just how hard it is to implement change when you feel like it's one more, it feels like one more thing, and it's not addressing the, the level of stress that they're already under. And it seems like it's adding more stress when what we want to do is give them tools that are going to reduce that stress instead.
So I've heard this to me, some of you will remember that I always make a distinction that I learned from a superintendent between a problem and a dilemma. A problem being something that does have a solution and you can fix it, and a dilemma being something you can take constructive action on, but you can't fix permanently. And to me, that distinction that he made is like this, that, the exhaust system on your car is dragging and you get it replaced, it's fixed. That's a problem, it's fixed. A dilemma is like being a parent. It's incurable. You have children, that's what we say, but you have to let them go. You love them, but you could kill them. They make you feel proud and fulfilled, but terrified and furious. It's wonderful being with them. It's fabulous getting away from them. And you can't fix this. You're not helpless, you cope, but you don't cope once and then it's done. The distinction here is about expectations. Anything we see as a problem, we expect it's going to fix it. I'm going to fix it. You're going to fix it. We're going to fix it. Anything we read as a dilemma, we expect to do something positive, but we're not surprised when we have to revisit it. And what makes something a dilemma is either that it's so complex, having both positive and negative features, right? Or that it's so much out of our control. So like COVID. And the bigger the dilemma, the more my notion about change has to shift, so that the change that people are grappling with is unplanned change from outside, COVID and all this stuff, the political toxicity in the country, say, whatever, that kind of stuff. We don't get to control that. And my honest take, Chris, if I go right back to where you began us, is that it's just not reasonable to expect people to have much bandwidth for all the things we wish and they wish they could concentrate on. Because there's just too much other stuff that's front and center, and that is often urgent, even when it's not really long-term important, and if we never had heard of COVID, but we could write the scenario, you say, well, how about a life-threatening viral infection that's pernicious and dangerous and unpredictable, and that's going to require people to, if they want to be safe, to wear masks and stuff like this. What kind of impact do you think that will have on a school's effort to improve its instructional practices? I would say a huge impact. So if I were honest, I think the longer COVID stays with us and the more serious any part of it is, the less likely it is that people are going to have the bandwidth. People to me means ultimately faculty, but in the shorter run, it means leadership teams, or in the more immediacy, not shorter run, more immediately, leadership teams, because there's just so much to cope with. So Chris, you're right that people do have and also need skills to be able to solve those larger, questions that we want innovation to answer, right? But if I'm honest, I haven't been in touch with anybody in any school anywhere who's got much left over right now. Maybe that'll, that may change as the year goes on. If COVID lessens a great deal and dwindles away and whatever, that would be maybe a different. But the other thing, Chris, is that even if it doesn't get any worse, we're in year 2. And it seems to me there's some kind of cumulative impact here, which is that even if the situation isn't technically worse, not medically worse, people are in year 2 of the ongoing stress of it. And I don't think there are skills that you can teach people that will wipe that out. There are things that will help, but all those things are going to require, among other things, patience and time. And I think it's just a really tough climate to be asking leadership teams to press classroom teachers to be doing a whole lot of new stuff because they're having trouble just getting through. And
Rob,
go ahead, Eddie. I'm done.
So one of the questions that keeps coming up in my mind is, should we shift our attention from pushing forward with good curriculum instruction and assessment and innovation and creativity and that sort of thing, the kind of what we were pushing on pre-COVID?
Yes.
Should schools shift their attention to helping parents understand what you just talked about in order to create some relief or an attempt to get some relief for teachers in terms of the demands parents are putting on them? Or should teachers understand this to a great degree so they can have some empathy and sympathy for their fellow teachers, and the students are experiencing it as well? So there's a question in there somewhere. I don't know if it's answerable or not, but that's
so
part
the
of
answer,
what I wonder.
There is my answer, Eddie. My quick answer would be yes. The challenge would be how to do it. But it's a really, really good question. So to me, there's a difference between what we would wish and where we actually are. And the wish is that we could soldier on despite. But if I think, for example, about trying to promote classroom innovation and in teaching methods and that curriculum and stuff, and then I meet a teacher in 8th grade who's doing 8th grade English, but the kids are behaving like they're in 6th grade. It's not clear to me that she needs anything except more help about how to teach a 6th grader, which is something she hasn't had to do, as opposed to thinking about how she's going to somehow elevate the way she's teaching 8th graders. My anticipation is that the behavioral stuff with kids will improve. It'll especially improve if schools get firmer about the limits they set on behavior, in my view. But I think it will. I think it's just going to take longer, Eddie, than we imagined. And if I go way back pre-COVID, I have almost always felt that I think almost every school I've ever been in that had a serious improvement agenda and really cared about it was trying to do more than it could sooner than it could. And I often have found that not that they needed to give up on the goal, Eddie, but that the timeline needed to be more realistic in terms of how long it takes for the implementation. So to me, this intrusion of COVID this last nearly 2 years has been a more dramatic illustration of that. Now, the question of what message we can get to parents is complicated by the fact that they have to pay attention. And you can have an evening, but when you have an evening, you usually get the choir to come, and the unwashed don't come for cleansing. So there's a challenge about what you can do about that. Interestingly, I was talking with a middle school head just yesterday, who said that she finally had it, and she did a thing for the parents in which she said, in middle school, we're used to seeing pre-adolescent, early adolescent, and then getting ready for later adolescence. And here's what they each look like. Only what's happening at the moment is that at each level, we're seeing one down. And she gave the parents some actual descriptions of the kinds of things they would expect kids in 8th grade to be able to do, but not kids in 6th grade, and that the 8th graders aren't able to do at the moment. She actually was pretty specific about it. The parents who came were very grateful. And she felt like it took the pressure level down a notch, the way you just mentioned, Eddie, in a way. The trouble was, of course, that she only had some of them. But I do think that schools, and I think some of us outside of schools, need to do whatever we can to reset people's expectations about what constitutes meaningful progress in a context that's so difficult as this. Internally, inside the school, whatever the external world is, whatever the parents think, or the state, or for that matter, the district office, I think those of you who are principals and as you sit with your teams, it would really be helpful if you were able to acknowledge what you wish and then to think really hard about what would be the most meaningful thing you could achieve now. And I do know from a lot of experience that if teachers don't feel that their leaders really care about what it's like for them right now, it's pretty hard to win their allegiance for some new idea. So Eddie, it was a really good question, and you can see my answer is not full of good cheer.
No, thank you. I think you're right that in the sense of all the groups that we're talking with are kind of in the same spot. So thank you for that.
So the two of you who escaped the principalship and are now safely ensconced, and I'm teasing, I'll stop teasing. When you think about, you both said, well, I sort of feel guilty and so on. When you think about the people who are there in the schools, in the buildings, and think about what their needs are, I mean, what's top of mind for you?
I don't know if you want to go first or if you want me to go first. I would just, to me, it's the behavior that's so, and that part of it may just be my awareness of what they're being faced with. I'm in a large district where there's almost 80 campuses, and in my new role, I have this app and I get a notification every time there's something that's pretty significant that occurs on a campus. And there are days where it just goes off nonstop. I mean, like a kid drove his car into the back of the school. Violent, you're saying 8th graders are acting like 6th graders. I would say violent 6th graders, the aggressiveness that kids are.
Yes.
And we're a suburban wealthy district. We have some low income kids, but it's not typical behavior that a lot of our teachers are used to dealing with, if that
Correct.
makes sense. Not the assumption that every low income school has more of that behavior, but it is just different. And
yes.
And maybe, like my previous school, my previous 2 years there, we had one actual fight in those 2 years. I think they've had 20 this year, the last time I talked to my replacement. And she, her joke, the new principal, who's amazing, she was my assistant principal. She was like, these aren't regular Frisco fights. These are like for real fights, like where she can't, where they're just having to pull kids apart. Sometimes they're leaving the school in handcuffs because they're so violent and aggressive and things like that.
Yes.
So just like, I just don't even know what I would do if I was in that boat of dealing with that quantity day in and day out.
So that's a classic case of a place where you say innovation, probably not now.
Mm-mm. But I don't know if I'm getting off topic here as you're talking about dilemma. And I think I've heard you talk about this before, but there's almost a skill set I feel like that I know I lack, a lot of people lack, and seems prevalent in our society today. If you're facing a dilemma, and I think we're facing several, because it's not just this, there's also CRT and the pushback on all the books and literature that we're facing right now. And you have to be able to hold multiple perspectives in consideration at all times when you're facing a dilemma, if I understand what you're saying correctly. And that's a skill. That in itself is a skill of not just assuming because somebody hates masks that they're a bad parent, or vice versa, that they love masks, that they're just trying to control us. And, you know, there's this so much focus on splitting and like being on all, but we have to be able to balance all those things, because we serve kids, whether their parents feel this way, or somewhere in between.
Yes.
That's not really a question. This is kind of an aha when you're talking.
No, it's absolutely right. I'm watching the heads nod as you're speaking.
I would say for me, the amount of time I think that our campus administrators are spending with talking with parents and mediating situations between parents and teachers, or you know, just talking to them about things, the behaviors the kids are exhibiting are I think that's where my guilt comes from, is just the amount of time that they're spending outside of school hours, you know, supporting those needs. And I really, when Eddie said that about the, you know, maybe we should shift our attention to educating our parents on, you know, what we're seeing at school. I think I've always kind of functioned under that philosophy that, I mean, our biggest advocates and the people who are going to support us the most when a school is going through a difficult time, it's going to be the parents. It's going to be your community. PTA, always a huge focus. Transparent walls of your school, you know, getting the parents in there. I think that's the schools that are doing those things are really, I think, seeing the most relief from some of the stress of having the angry parents or the challenges. They're more supportive whenever they feel they're a part of your team instead of working against you. And I think that the thing the pandemic has done to our families is separated them from us. And so we're really working to encourage our principals, when you are talking to a parent or when they are emailing you angry, tell them, I absolutely want to discuss this with you. Can you come up to the school, or can I meet you somewhere to discuss it? You know, like, can we, you know, get together face to face? Because that seems to be helping a lot. And I think that sometimes it's so much easier to just meet on, you know, to talk on the phone or to meet on a Zoom or Teams to talk to a parent. And it's easier for them if they're at work. But I think that we've got to get back face to face. I think that's really mitigating to the challenges we're having with the parents. So I think the thing that we need to focus on most is rebuilding those relationships to the point where we're supporting each other again.
Which is right, but hard when people are just trying to keep the place running during the day.
And we're losing teachers left and right. I mean, we have teacher shortage up here in North Texas. I mean, it's really bad.
I think
we can't fill.
I think this is true all over the place. I think there are a lot of places that are dreading what it's going to be like staffing for next year. So on.
And they're leaving because they can get paid more to do there are so many jobs out there, and they can get paid more to do it, and they don't have to deal with the stresses that they are dealing with in the classroom right now.
So there are a couple of things that emerge for me. Eddie, you've started, I think this is actually an important path for us to think about. It may be that if we were to think of what I'm going to call for the moment, a more standard notion of supporting innovation and improvement in curriculum and instruction and so on. if we think about all that and agree that that's ideally where we'd like the needle to move back to at some point. The question is, between now and then, what can we do? And my take is actually that if we end up with a massive teacher shortage, say, in the country or in Texas, it's going to have a long-term impact on any of that stuff about innovation, which would be a shame, not just because it would be really good for the schools and the students, but because actually we've learned so much about how to innovate. It would be a shame not to be able to do it. But I think there's a real case to be made for thinking more creatively about how to support people. And by people, I mean all of you on this call, your leadership teams, and through you and your teams, faculty, in the face of all this. So one thing is this, when it comes to dealing with parents, there are actually a couple of approaches that most educators don't use, and which in my experience are a lot more successful than the ones they do use. What commonly happens when a teacher or a principal is under fire from a parent is they try to explain and justify and outline and clarify, etc. And very often the parent is in no position or condition to listen. And the conversation is hard. That's one reason why it's better in person. But even then, it's often hard. Well, it's possible, I've been doing a lot of this, to teach principals, for example, and through them, the administrators, and ultimately actually teachers, some different ways of talking about it. Here's one. A parent comes in and says, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, you're not doing the other. The normal response is, oh, yes, we are. Here's what we do. No, we don't do that. No, we don't do CRT. We do that. It's often a whole lot better to say, what were you hoping I would do? And the parent says, well, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. And then to be able to say, and if we can't or we don't, what are you worried about? And let them say, blah, 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 blah. Those are two simple questions, hopes and fears. You ask those two things seriously, and you have already started to take the temperature of the conversation down a couple of notches and improve the likelihood that the parent would be able to hear some of what you say. Right? So there are things like that that we could do for leadership teams. And actually, I've done a lot of this directly with faculty that would be helpful in terms of some of the coping. Secondly, my own belief is there's a whole lot of stuff that we normally have done that is just beside the point at the moment. Here's for instance, expecting principals who are serving lunch to be doing the full usual job about teacher evaluation strikes me as unrealistic. I mean, it's just, ask yourself what could be less important right now than going through a full evaluation with God knows, I don't know how you do it in Texas, 3 pre-visits and 4 post-visits and slaying a small forest about what gets written up. That's what we do in Massachusetts. I mean, it's not that we don't want to evaluate teachers, but what we're evaluating, when you're looking at somebody who's, teaching 12th graders and they're behaving like freshmen, somehow you got to find a way to take that into account, it seems to me. So I do think there's a case to be made for scaling back timetables and expectations and trying to scaffold in coping skills for everybody that are at a more, I don't know what to call it, basic level. So here's another one. I don't know about your various districts and schools, but in lots of the US, for a number of years now, there have been more teachers and more administrators who've been trying to operate on a system or with a set of assumptions that I sometimes think of as love and affirmation with the kids. And it's well-intentioned. But actually, you know, one of the things kids need and haven't had nearly enough of these last couple of years is limits and structure. And there are a lot of schools that actually need to be firmer about limits and structure, and a lot of classroom teachers that need to be firmer about it than they're used to being. And it won't make everything go away, but it would help. But I work in a lot of schools in New England where they're very proud of their trauma-informed practices. And they want to talk about all the kids who've been causing trouble and having fights as traumatized. I'm a psychologist. I know about trauma. They're not traumatized. Their behavior is out of control. And what they need is structure and limits. So I think there may be some real value in, and those of you who have moved into the district level, it may be worth thinking about this, about what ways are there to try to set some of our ideal goals aside and concentrate on the real life challenges that the classroom folks and the leadership teams and the principals are actually having to grapple with, at least for now, in the hope that we can find ways to speed the kids' return towards more school readiness, and also then relieve some of the stress on the educators, and thus recreate a climate where we can proceed with the kind of innovation that we know is needed. Eddie, you really started something. You got me on the soapbox here. I'm sorry, I don't normally do that as much, but I've been hearing so much of this. What you all have been saying, I mean, I hear this in New York. I hear it in Massachusetts. I hear it in California. I've heard it in Minnesota. I don't know a place in the country where people aren't grappling with versions of this. I really don't.
Well, I think what you've described too, Rob, is our tendency, I think all of us, our tendency is to be over the top empathetic,
Yep.
and assume, I don't know, assume good intent on everyone's part.
Yep.
And not that we can't assume good intent, but it is what you're saying is just the two questions is a strategy to
Yep.
start with.
Yep.
And to rethink our approach with discipline as to that boundaries are good. And what you said it last week too, which really struck me as well, is that, and you're an expert at this, so I take you at your word that trauma-informed care is a good thing for those who have experienced trauma.
Right.
But what we're seeing
is a very
not,
small number of students, a very small number. Lots of them had a rough time. It's been a hard year. A lot of them have been out of sorts. Most of them were socially deprived and missing their friends. It's not like I'm saying it's all been easy. That's very different from having post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
Well,
So that's
one of the things you said as we were just visiting before a lot of people got on the call, we were talking about the fact that when students were home, that in a lot of cases, their parents gave them what you call behavior waivers.
Yeah, a behavior waiver. They got a nice behavior waiver.
And, I think in some cases, and it's just like, it follows what Eddie just said, and what you talked about, that our natural way to do is to love them more, which is important. We need to do
Yep.
that.
Yep.
These description of being very empathetic and understanding of situations, but in doing those things, have we gone so far
Yep.
that we have been also guilty in schools of giving behavior waivers?
Yep.
And the idea that they need more limits and structure if we're going to get them past that. We're
Yep.
describing, teachers are describing, some of you have described behaviors from 2 or 3 years ago. And the only way to change that is to have more structure.
Yep.
and appropriate limits while loving them and being empathetic, but still, I think that's a good point. And we probably don't, any of us, focus much on that.
And I think, Roz, what comes with it for me is an extended timeline about what we expect. So I would want to see behavior improving notably between now and the end of the year, but I'm not expecting anybody to have fixed all the learning loss
Right.
between now and the end of the year. And the empathy and the love can go with limits. I still have my high school yearbook, which is 50 years old, and my social studies, my history teacher, whom I loved, but we had some things together, she wrote, I still got it, whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. And I think that's still true, actually, to be honest with you. That so the opportunities here, if we think about what they are, to me, are to provide supports now for what people are grappling with in a more immediate way, in the hopes of helping them move through this transition to get to a place where we can then resume what I'll call the full bore focus on the sorts of innovations that we would really like to be pursuing. So there are conversations sort of like this, which I've been moderating with faculty groups and with leadership teams and so on. And I don't know, Chris, about all 80 of your principals, but we could put them on a call and do some pieces of this and try to be, more concretely helpful to them, and hope that it would be a contribution in some way. But the other way to make the contribution is to say, well, okay, we were anticipating X, Y, and Z. It looks now like we really need to focus just on X right now, and that we're not going to get to Y and Z right away. We're going to try to get there later, but for right now, we need to zero in on, whatever it would be, and give people some permission. And that would then mean that those of you who are principals would be able to do the same thing with your leadership teams, and in turn, ultimately with your faculties as well. Because one of the things that really eats away at educators often is the vulnerability they have, it's a serious one in my view, to feeling like they haven't ever done enough. And this is classically a scenario for that. So it's really important to be able to help redefine for them what constitutes meaningful progress in the face of this exceptional challenge. So Samora, I don't want you to have to give up on the t-shirt. I don't. But I think that getting to all the things that are on the t-shirt may need some permission to take smaller steps about more basic stuff first. I think Jolly. Go ahead.
I said, I'm almost wondering, like, this is kind of making me think, like, go slow to go fast.
Yes.
Relieve a little bit of that pressure.
Yes.
I wonder if people won't then just do what they need to do. We don't want them to do that, but put pressure on themselves that makes this even, what I mean? But
I
relieve them. They may feel
as
free
long as the kids are behaving way behind, it's going to be hard to do a lot of stuff that we'd want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if people, what teachers have said repeatedly to me throughout the whole last year is, we don't just want praise. We want them, meaning leaders, we want them to know what it's like to be in our shoes.
Mm-hmm.
We want them to care and listen and show that they care, not just drop by and say you're doing great. Right. And I think if we can find some ways to do that also, we have a chance of kind of helping them cope and feel better about the way they're coping. So that when we do come through this finally, they can look back with some pride. And then we also know, hey, they actually did that. So now we can turn ourselves to a new challenge, and we can probably meet this one. So you didn't all know that you were going to get a sermon here today, did you? You know, if I'd have known I was going to give a sermon, I would have dressed differently myself, actually, tell you the honest truth. You know, and I certainly would not have let anybody into my church with those kind of socks, Charlie. There's no question about it. I'd expect modesty in socks, no, you know, in my church. Anyway, I'm glad to follow up with any of you at any point about this, because we haven't talked about anything this afternoon that isn't alive in every school I've been in touch with since the year began back in August.
So guys, our time is just about up. Does anybody have anything they want to, a question they want to pose to Rob, or a comment or something you'd like to share with the group?
No, I've just stunned them.
I'm sure they're all thinking.
It's a lot to think about. It really is. Yeah. Anyway, if there,
the last time I heard you
talk,
talk, Rob, you dropped the F word, so I wasn't expecting a sermon at all.
well, you know, in my church, in my father's house, there are many mansions, and in some mansions, occasionally the language is more colorful, and other times it's not. But I'm trying to mend my ways here, you know, Chris.
I'm always reminded of the Ellen DeGeneres show where she's interviewing the lady from Austin, and the lady I can't remember, it says, well, I cuss a little. No, what is it? I cuss a little, but I love Jesus, or something like that. I cuss a little, or something along those lines.
Yeah. Okay.
So there you go.
Eddie.
There you go.
Here's Eddie.
Yeah.
It says, I cuss a lot, but I love Jesus. Because I have that shirt.
You have that shirt. There you go.
All right, good. All right, so I'm going to wish you all the best for your holidays and for the year. And if anybody wants to follow up at any point, I'll be glad to do it.
Great. Thank you, Rob. It's
good luck to you all.
Thank you.
From you, and I'm sure we'll be getting back in touch with you soon.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.